We continue now at the top of Daf Yud Ches Amud Aleph and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 18a. On the previous Amud, the Gemara was in the middle of bringing the second source that a mechusar begadim, a Kohen who's not wearing all of the garments of the Kahuna, if he does the avoda of the karbanos, then that avoda is profaned, it is disqualified. And the Gemara brings a brisa. The brisa is talking about shesuya yayin, the Kohanim that are doing the avoda and they have drunk wine, so that's also, the avoda is also disqualified in such a situation. That's learned out from the pasuk of Ulahavdil bein hakodesh uvein hachol. And the Gemara now is saying, how do we know to extend that also to the case of mechusar begadim and also to the case of rechitzas yad v'regel if the Kohen doesn't wash his hands and his feet. And the brisa continues, Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says, chuka l'gzeira shav. It says the word chuka in all three of these places. We make a gzeira shav and we say it's the same across the board. In all three of these cases, the avod is going to be profaned. Rashi explains chuka b'shesuya yain ksiv chukas olam. By the kohanim that drink wine, it says chukas olam. Uve mechusar begadim ksiv kohuna l'chukas olam. And by mechusar begadim, it also says l'chukas olam. Uve rechitzas yad v'regel ksiv v'aisolem l'chukas olam. It also says chukas olam when it comes to rechitzas yad v'regel. And again, that's l'gzeira shava. So we make a gzeira shava. Now the Gemara here is in the middle of asking a question because this is now the second source that we're bringing. That mechusar begadim, if the Kohen does the avodah not wearing all of the garments, that then we would say the avodah is profane, it's disqualified. And so the Gemara now continues and says, Imei Hasim, if we only had over there, meaning if we only had this source of Shesuya Yayin, Hava Amina, one might have thought, Hani Mili Avoda, the Zor Chayev Oleh Misa, that we're only talking about the kinds of avodas where a non-Kohen would be Chayev Misa. We'll see Rashi in a moment. Aval Avoda de Ein Zor Chayev Oleh Misa. But if it would be an avoda that a non-Kohen is not Chayev Misa, Eimalo, so then I would say that this Mechusar Begadim, let's say the person does those kinds of avodas, Mechusar Begadim, I would say that it's not necessarily disqualified. Kamash Malon, so that's what the first source comes to teach us. Rashi explains, Imei Hasam mi Shesuya Yayin. If I only had the source from Shesuya Yayin, again with the Gzeir Shavav Chuka, Hava Mina Hani Mili Demachli Avoda, I would think it's only, the Avoda is only profaned, but Mechusar Begadim, by Mechusar Begadim, so again, a Kohen not wearing all of the garments of the Kahuna, Be Avoda Shazor Chayev Olah Misa, that would only apply by an Avoda where a non-Kohen is Chayev Misa. Kedichsiv Bahukra, as is written in that Pasuk, Bevo Achem El Oel Moed Velo Samusu, it mentions Velo Samusu, it talks about Misa, Avoda sheyesh ba chiyuv misa lepsulim hakasim edaber. The pasuk is talking about avoda where there's a chiyuv misa if someone who's disqualified does that avoda. Ve'ena ela arba avodos. That actually only applies by 4 avodos, and those are zrika, v'haktara, v'nisach hamayim, and v'hayayin. It applies to Zrika, which is the throwing of the blood. Haktara is the burning of the emurim, or the burning of whatever the sacrificial portions are. And Nisach HaMayim is the libations of the water, and Nisach HaYayin, the libations of the wine. Kedi Alfinan beperak Beis b'Seder Yuma. We learned this out in the second parak of Meseches Yuma. Mivavadatem avodas matana v'azar hakarev Yuma. So it talks about a non-Kohen getting the death penalty for doing the avoda. And we understand it to be by avodas matana. It has to be an avoda involving a gift. Velo avodas siluk. Not in a kind of avoda that would involve removing something. And also, vavadatem avoda tama, it has to be an avoda tama, which means the finishing avoda. Velo avoda sheyesh acharei avoda, not an avoda where there's an avoda that comes after it. Kegon kabola v'holachu kmitza, for example, receiving the blood, conveying the blood, doing the kmitza by a karva mincha, all of those, there's an avoda that follows. So it doesn't apply to those. V'chol chiyuv misos pipsule avoda mizoras gamrinan. Rashi notes that anytime somebody who's disqualified to do the avoda, that there's a chiyuv misa, that's all learned from Zar. Zar is the source. Kedetanan beparak basar. We're going to see that in the Mishnah in the last parak. Hakomet zvabol vayotzik v'hamekabel damim ve'in bohem lo mishum zorus v'lo mishum tuma v'lo mishum mechusar begadim v'lo mishum shelo rachatz yadayim v'raglayim alma. You see from there mizar gamrinon that it's all learned from the non-Kohen. And Rashi continues, Aval avoda she'in zar chayev olah misa emalo. But if it would be an avoda where zar is not chayev misa, so I would say lo machli lo mechusar begadim. I would say that a Kohen is mechusar begadim. It's not necessarily disqualified. Lahachi kasa. For that reason, it's written v'haisol lahem lekunas olam. That was the first pasuk that we brought in the previous Talmud. That's why we have that pasuk. L'shavinu zarim. That pasuk says that somebody who's mechusar begadim is considered like a non-Kohen. Keshein bigdeyam aleim, if they're not wearing all their garments. When a Kohen doesn't doesn't wear the proper garments, he's like a zar. Uvizar eshkechon chilul, and by a zar, by a non-kohen, we find that the avodah is profaned. V'lo chilek bein avodah sheyesh b'misa la'avodah she'ein b'misa, and there is no distinction between an avodah with a death penalty and an avodah without a death penalty. And again, so therefore, that's what we learn from that first source. And the Gemara continues, Eshkechon mechusar begadim. So now we find the source by mechusar begadim that it applies. We say the avodah is disqualified, even if it's something that doesn't involve the death penalty. But shesuya yayin minolan. So from where do we know to apply that by shesuya yayin? That again, the avodah would be profaned in all types of avodos. It doesn't have to be one that involves the death penalty. And so now the Gemara says, Asya chuka mechusar begadim. We actually learn the other direction. We do a gzer shava chuka from mechusar begadim. Now that by mechusar begadim it applies by everything, so too over here by Shasuya Yayin, it applies by everything. Rashi explains, Eshkechan mechusar begadim b'chol ha'avodos. We now know mechusar begadim profanes all avodos. So Shasuya Yayin menolan, from where do we know it? By Shasuya Yayin, the pasli avodah shein hazar chayiv ala misa, that let's say the Kohen drinks wine, that would disqualify an avodah where a non-Kohen would not be chayiv misa. And so again, the Gemara answered that Shasuya Yayin will be learned from the Gzeira Shava of chuka in this regard. But the Gemara continues and asks, V'hatana ulahavdil bein kanasivla. But the Tana did not bring from chuka by Shasuya Yayin. The Tana brought from the pasuk of ulahavdil bein hakodesh uvein hachol. Again, the Tana of the Brisa first learned Shasuya Yayin from ulahavdil, and then chuka was going in the other direction. That's where we were learning from Shasuya Yayin to the case of mechusar begadim. Rashi says, V'hatana milahavdil kanasivla l'Shasuya Yayin. The source for Shasuya Yayin was lahavdil. V'lo gamar migzeira shava. It wasn't learning Shasuya Yayin from a gzeira shava. V'anon neku v'niflo galo l'meilaf mikra achrina. Now we're going to go argue on the Tana and learn from a different pasuk. We're going to learn from this gzeira shava when that's not what it said in the Brisa. And the Gemara continues and answers, Mekami deleikum gzeira shava. We learned from the pasuk ulahavdil Shasuya Yayin before we had the gzeira shava, but once we have the gzeira shava, we can actually learn Shasuya Yayin from mechusar begadim with the gzeira shava. Rashi explains, Hani mili Mekami deteiku le gzeira shava lo havale lemeilaf Shasuya Yayin elami lahavdil. You have to learn Shasuya Yayin from lahavdil before the gzeira shava. Uvemaskana idkar le gzeira shava. But then in the conclusion of the Gemara, the conclusion of the Brisa that we mentioned the gzeira shava, Vitana shavke lo orche kamais. And so the Tana therefore abandons the first way of learning and instead chooses the Gzeira Shava L'Meilef Shasuya Yayin Mimechusar Begadim, to learn Shasuya Yayin from Mechusar Begadim. But the Gemara continues and asks, V'atana mechusar begadim hu de kayalef mi Shasuya Yayin. But the Tana, isn't he learning mechusar begadim from Shasuya Yayin? Again, it's going in the other direction. It's not Shasuya Yayin from mechusar begadim, it's mechusar begadim from Shasuya Yayin. And the Gemara answers to that, Hachi Kamar, this is what the Tana is saying, Minayin shalo nachluk bein mechusar begadim l'Shasuya Yayin v'shalo rochatz yadayim v'raglayim. How do we know not to make a distinction between mechusar begadim and Shasuya Yayin and shalo rochatz yadayim v'raglayim? Talmud lomar chuka l'gzeira shava. The pasuk says chuka again for the gzeira shava. And Rashi explains, V'atana nakta l'gzeira shava mechusar begadim hu diyalafa mi Shasuya Yayin. The Tana is learning mechusar begadim from Shasuya Yayin v'lo shavke l'orchi. So the Tana is not abandoning its original limud. And the Gemara then answered, V'hachi kamar minayin shalo nachlok liolam lolam elef mechusar begadim mishasuya yayin asa. Really, the Tana was not learning mechusar begadim from Shasuya Yayin. That's incorrect. Elo lamelef Shasuya Yayin mechusar begadim. It was the other direction. Shasuya Yayin in the Brisa is being learned from mechusar begadim. V'hachi kamar, and this is what it was saying. Lamadnu la'avodos shel misa shemeschalos b'shechus. Again, we understand that if you have an avodah involving the death penalty, so then we say that b'shechus, if the Kohen is intoxicated, then the avodah will be profaned. Minayin shelo nachlok bein mechusar begadim l'Shasuya Yayin. Now, how do we know that we shouldn't make a distinction between mechusar begadim and Shasuya Yayin? Techihechi de mechusar begadim kol avodos of pesulos. Just like by mechusar begadim, all avodos are possible, even those not involving misa. Av Shasuya Yayin v'shelo rochatz kein. That would be true also. How do we know that's also true by Shasuya Yayin, one who drinks wine, and shelo rochatz, one who doesn't wash the hands and the feet? Talmud lomar chuka. That's what the pasuk says, chuka. And the Gemara continues and asks, Ela lahavdil lamali, but according to that, what is lahavdil for? Again, lahavdil originally was to learn out Shasuya Yayin. Now we're learning Shasuya Yayin with the Gzeira Shava of chuka. And the Gemara says, L'chid Rav, that's for the teaching of Rav. The Rav lo mukim amora alem yom tava lechavre. Rav would not set up his disseminator from one Yom Tov to the next, misham shichrus, because of drunkenness. And Rashi explains, Ela bein hachol lamali hoel v'lo yalfinan minach chilul la'avoda, since we're not learning from there anymore the idea of chilul, the idea that the avoda is profaned, and the answer is really, we're using that pasuk, lo mukim amora le midrash bepirk, and Rav would not have his amora, his disseminator, get up, because he used to darshan publicly, miyom tava lechavre, meaning, misha sha'achal v'shasa v'asa Yom Tov, from the time that he ate and drank and made a Yom Tov, ad l'machar, he would wait until the next day, Dahachi mashma kra, because that's what the pasuk is saying. Yayin v'shecher al teisht b'voachem v'chein v'shosha atabal lahavdil u'lahoros bein davar kedusha l'davar chol al tishechros. When you're coming to separate between what is kodesh and what is chol, there shouldn't be drunkenness. The idea is he shouldn't teach, he shouldn't issue rulings in a state of drunkenness, and that's why he would wait to give the shir until that time had passed, the time of drinking had passed. But the Gemara continues and asks, Akati, still my hacha nafka, is it really learned from over here, meaning that first source we brought on the previous Amud, v'haisol lehem kahuna lechukas olam, that's the source we brought from Mechusar begadim. Is that really the source? But my hasav nafka, it's learned from over there, from the following pasuk, v'nosnu b'nei Aaron HaKohen, and we understand it to mean bikihuno, they have to be in their kahuna. Limed al kohen gadol shalavash bigdei kohen hedyot. This pasuk teaches us that if a kohen gadol wears the begadim, the garments of a kohen hedyot, v'yavad avodah, so pesul, and he does the avodah, his avodah is disqualified. So you see the Mechusar begadim idea from this pasuk. And the Gemara continues and answers, Imei hasam hava mina hani mili avoda to miakva kapara. If we just had the first source in the previous Amud, I would think it's only by an avoda that's required for the kapara, for the atonement. We'll see Rashi in a moment. Avol avoda de lo makva kapara lo. But an avoda that's not required for the kapara, one wouldn't necessarily know it applies over there, and that's what we learn from this pasuk of V'nosnu b'nei Aaron HaKohen. And the Gemara continues, V'akati mehacha nafka, but still is it learned from here. Mehasam nafka, it's learned from there. We have another source. It says, V'yorchu b'nei Aaron HaKohanim es hanesachim HaKohanim bikihunan. Again, it says the Kohanim have to be bikihunan. Mikan, and from here we learn, L'kohen hedyot shalavash bigdei kohen gadol, that if a kohen hedyot wears the begadim of the kohen gadol, he wears more begadim than he's supposed to. V'yavad avodah so psul, and he does the avodah, his avodah is disqualified. And the Gemara says to that, Imei hasam, if we just had from over there, hava amina hani mili chisor, I would think that only applies to lacking garments, meaning if we just had our first source, avol yisor lo, but having extra garments, maybe it would not apply, kamash malon, and that's what this pasuk is teaching, that even if it's extra garments, like a kohen hedyot wearing the begadim of a kohen gadol, that is also a disqualification. And Rashi explains, mehacha nafka, is learned from over here, from our first source, mechusar begadim, mehasam nafka, it's really learned from there, akati krach, rinak sivel l'may yitzrach, we have another pasuk. What do we need this pasuk for? L'may yitzrach hakohen hacha gabe v'nosnu b'nei Aaron hakohen eish la'ashminan mechusar begadim. Why do we need this second pasuk? That second pasuk the Gemara brought again is v'nosnu b'nei Aaron hakohen eish. It's talking about placing the fire on the mizbeach, and we learn from the pasuk bikihuno that it has to be with the kahuna garments. B'shashu melubash begadim, when he's wearing his garments, nikra Aaron hakohen. That's when he's called Aaron hakohen. V'lokashu lavush bigdei hedyot. Not when he's wearing bigdei hedyot. Again, it's teaching us specifically that a kohen gadol, if he's not wearing all the begadim of the kahuna gadola, he's wearing the begadim only of the kohen hedyot, then that's a disqualification. You see the idea of mechusar begadim from there. Why do we need that pasuk? And the Gemara then said, Imei hasam v'haisel lehem kahuna. If we just had v'haisel lehem kahuna, the first pasuk from the previous Amud, hava mukmina le'ahi ba'avoda hamakeves kapara. One would think that's only by avoda that's required for the atonement. Avol nesinas eish shel hedyot, but this pasuk that we're talking about is the placing of the fire on the mizbech, which was done by the kohen hedyot. The mitzvah bialmi, that's just a mitzvah. It's not something that's absolutely required. Sharei yesham esha yardim in hashamayim. There already was a fire there that descended from heaven. Emaloti boy begadim. So one might say that the begadim are not required. Kamash malon. That's what this pasuk is teaching. V'nosnu b'nei Aaron hakohen eish lahachi kasav hacha chesron begadim l'meilaf da'af ve'avoda sheina mechusar kapara. That's why we have this idea of chisron begadim here to say it applies even by an avoda which is not required for the kapara. The yavad Aaron bevigdei hedyot lav shaper over. The idea again that if Aaron serves in the bigdei hedyot, meaning the idea mechusar begadim, that's not good. And Rashi continues and notes v'halekal mifrach, and you can't ask leima hay veloti boyahu. Let's just say this pasuk. Why not only have the pasuk of v'nosnu b'nei Aaron hakohen eish, which would teach us the mechusar begadim by an avoda which is not required for kapara, and then for sure it would be true by an avoda that's required for kapara. Why do we need that pasuk of v'haisalam kuna l'chukas olam? And the answer is the hacha la'av begodim ksivi. Here it doesn't say anything about begodim. V'lav dekas of v'haisalam kahuna. If not for v'haisalam kahuna, eitzel v'chagartos amavne, which is talking there clearly about begodim. The shaminon kahuna tuluya bebegodim. You see that the kahuna is dependent on the begodim. Lo havi yadinon hakoyin bekihuna mahi. I wouldn't have known what does it mean hakoyin bekihuna over here. And Rashi continues, HaKohanim, again, Avnei Aaron Koi Dahava Hedyotim. That's going on Bnei Aaron, which refers to regular Kohanim. The Gemara brought this other source, Bekihunan, Beru'uyin, Lohen, Shenislas, Kunasan, Behen. Again, that's the idea they have to wear the proper garments. A Kohen Hedyot shouldn't wear the garments of a Kohen Gadol. And then the Gemara said, Imei Hasam V'Haisalam Kuna. If we just had that first source of V'Haisalam Kuna, so that's Chisur. That's when you're lacking garments. Could go in Kohen Gadol, but big Kohen Hedyot, like a Kohen Gadol wearing the begodim of a Kohen Hedyot, Avol Yisur, but wearing more garments. Could go in Kohen Hedyot, but big Kohen Gadol. I wouldn't necessarily know that that's problematic when a Kohen Hedyot wears the begodim of a Kohen Gadol. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Hayu Merushalan, let's say the begodim of the Kohen are dragging on the ground, or Misulakin, let's say they're too high up, they don't go down far enough. Mishuchakim, let's say they're old, or they're worn garments. V'yavad avodas uksher, if he does the avod in any of these, the avod is still kosher. Lavash shnei mechnasayim, shnei avnetim, let's say he wears two mechnasayim, he wears two avnetim, or chaser achas, yeser achas, he's lacking a garment, he has an extra garment. O shahaisalo retial makas besaro tachas begadu, let's say he has a bandage on a wound that's underneath the garment. O shahayu, or if he has. And Rashi explains, Kesheir and it's kosher again if it's dragging, or let's say it's too high. So even though the pasuk says it should be according to the exact measure of the Kohen, mitzvah bialmi, that's just a mitzvah, v'lo la'akev, it's not something that's absolutely required. Chisar achas mikol ha'begadim, if he's missing a beged, yisar achas, if he has extra, hosef aleim shum beged biolam, he adds on any beged. Ritia, again a bandage, shechotzetz bein besaro lebeged, it's a chatzitza, separation between his flesh and the beged. It has to be that the garments are worn on his flesh, on his skin, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis.